Plastic is not just a material. It is a mirror of our civilization. It floats on rivers, clogs the soil, poisons the air, and outlives entire generations. For most of the world, a bottle is waste, useless, endless, cursed. But in Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation too often dismissed as powerless, one man dared to see what others refused. Ibrahim Traoré looked at the poison and saw possibility. Where others saw decay, he saw a foundation. Where the world turned away, he bent down to pick up what was abandoned. Imagine a country where millions live without safe houses, where schools collapse under open skies, where electricity remains a dream for entire villages. Now imagine this, a single idea rising from the riverbanks, turning garbage into homes, trash into light, despair into dignity. Stay with us. This is not just recycling, it is a turning point in history. Subscribe now and walk with us, because what comes next may change the way you see both waste and the destiny of Africa. From bottles to bricks, from silence to revolution, from the riverbed to the classroom, this is the story of how the smallest object can carry the heaviest hope. Rubbish is easy to ignore until it starts to define your life. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, every market day leaves behind mountains of plastic bottles. They pile up in alleyways, clog roadside drains, and gather in streams that once carried clean water. Farmers complain that the soil is breaking under their feet, poisoned by the fibers of plastic that never decompose. Villagers burn heaps of bottles in desperation, sending black smoke into the sky and choking their own lungs. At the same time, poverty carves wounds into daily life. Families huddle under fragile roofs made of straw or corrugated tin. Heavy rains turn homes into muddy traps, flooding possessions and erasing what little comfort exists. Schools collapse into open-air shelters where children sit on the ground to study, their notebooks wet, their futures fragile. Hospitals cannot keep electricity running. Patients are treated by torchlight, nurses straining their eyes through darkness. Poverty and pollution feed each other like a vicious circle. And for decades, the poor were told they had nothing to offer but their suffering. Then came a simple but radical answer. Ibrahim Traoré asked a question that seemed absurd. What if bottles could build a future? The idea was not born in laboratories or ministerial offices, but on riverbanks where he saw plastic waste floating by the thousands. To the world, they were rubbish. To him, they were bricks waiting to be picked up. His team began to collect bottles by the million. Young men dragged sacks of plastic from the gutters of Ouagadougou. Women washed and dried them in the sun. Each bottle was packed tightly with sand or soil until it became hard as stone, an object they called an eco-brick. When stacked together and bound with mortar, these bottles transformed into walls strong enough to rival concrete. But they were cheaper, lighter, and carried a message. The poor could build their own dignity. The first demonstration house stood at the edge of a dusty village. 2 small rooms, 20,000 bottles, and an entire revolution hidden in the walls. Children ran their hands over the smooth plaster, laughing in disbelief. To them, this was not just a shelter. It was proof that something once despised could be transformed into pride. Mothers walked through the doorway with relief, no longer fearing the floods that once soaked their beds. Fathers stood with calloused hands resting on the walls, whispering, "I built this with what the world abandoned." But Ibrahim's vision stretched beyond one house. He imagined entire villages built from waste, schools where children could learn without rain dripping on their books, clinics where patients could rest without fear of roofs collapsing. He imagined a Burkina Faso that would not wait for donors to deliver solutions, but would build them out of what others had thrown away. The eco-bricks were more than construction material. They were a declaration. Each wall carried the silent voice of people too often told they were powerless. Each bottle lifted from the river was a small act of sovereignty, a refusal to accept decay as destiny. And yet, this was only the first chapter. The bottles had more to give, not just as walls, but as fire, as light, as a new heartbeat for villages long trapped in darkness. What if plastic could not only build homes, but also power an entire nation? The true power of an idea is not measured in theories, but in the moments it changes lives. In one village outside Ouagadougou, children stepped into a classroom built entirely from bottles. Their fingers traced the plastered walls, marveling at what they could not believe. The roof above them was strong, the floor beneath them was dry, and for once the rain could not chase them away. Laughter filled the room, not from jokes but from relief. To study without fear of storms was, for these children, a form of liberation. Then came the night that electricity arrived. In a rural clinic, a nurse who had spent years holding torches between her teeth during childbirth finally switched on a lamp powered by recycled plastic fuel. She wept openly as the room lit up, her hands free for the first time to welcome a new life with dignity. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Tonight I have light." That single bulb was not just technology, it was justice. The story spread quickly. Mothers who had sheltered their babies under leaking roofs now laid them down to sleep inside walls of eco-bricks. Fathers who once feared the future now walked proudly through bottle-built doorways, saying, "This house will stand long after I am gone." Young men who had been idle in the streets lined up to collect bottles, singing as they worked, finding purpose in what had been waste. Women joined cooperatives to prepare eco-bricks for sale, transforming household rubbish into livelihoods. What had been garbage was now the rhythm of survival and solidarity. The emotional crest reached its height when Ibrahim himself stood before a crowd in one of the new schools. His voice was steady but fierce. "These bottles are not garbage. They are our future. With our hands, we will build not only homes and schools, but dignity. Our young people will not hold guns. They will hold bricks. They will not destroy. They will create." The crowd erupted. Parents, children, elders rose to their feet. Applause thundered, but what filled the air was not only sound, it was belief. For the first time, the poor of Burkina Faso were no longer told they had nothing. They had proof in the walls around them that even the smallest, most despised object could be turned into sovereignty. National media began to call it the green revolution of plastic. Radio stations carried testimonies of mothers who no longer feared the rains, of teachers who no longer taught beneath trees, of farmers who no longer burned plastic in despair. Social media filled with photos of colorful bottle houses, symbols of a new era sprouting from the soil of poverty. For the first time in years, the nation spoke not of scarcity, but of creation. Yet the reaction was not limited to villages or newspapers. Politicians in Ouagadougou took notice. Some hailed the initiative as a symbol of national pride, proof that Burkina Faso could build without waiting for foreign aid. Others saw it as a challenge to the old order, a shift of power from elites to ordinary villagers. Either way, the movement was impossible to ignore, and the momentum only grew. As one father put it, "I once told my son to leave, to search for work in another land. Now I tell him to stay." Here in our own soil, even bottles can become a future. The spirit of the people had turned. From despair to dignity, from silence to song, the nation was moving. But outside the applause, another stage was preparing itself. One far larger, one where the eyes of the world would soon be fixed. The villages had spoken. The nation had begun to transform. But how would the world respond when Burkina Faso declared sovereignty with bottles in its hands? Change in Burkina Faso did not remain abstract. It became visible in the fabric of daily life. The most immediate transformation was shelter. Families who had spent years under roofs that leaked with every storm now stepped into houses that stood firm against rain and heat. For millions classified as lacking adequate housing, this was not luxury, it was survival. A home built from bottles carried more than walls. It carried dignity, stability, and hope. Work followed quickly. For every eco-brick house, dozens of people were needed. Bottle collectors on river banks, women washing and drying the bottles, young men packing them with sand, masons binding them into walls. A green economy took root where despair had once flourished. Unemployment, once a constant shadow, began to recede. Young people discovered identity as builders instead of drifters, as creators instead of casualties. Elders, long afraid that their sons would vanish into militias or migration routes, began to speak with relief. Work had replaced wandering, and with it came the first sparks of pride. Health, too, improved. With fewer bottles burned in open pits, the air cleared. Children coughed less at night. Mothers reported fewer cases of respiratory illness. And the thick smoke that once lingered above villages began to dissipate. Mosquitoes lost their breeding grounds in stagnant pools of plastic waste. Clinics powered by recycled biofuel gained steady light, extending treatment hours and reducing preventable deaths. Even the forest felt the relief. With less firewood needed, trees stood longer, rains returned with greater consistency, and farmers spoke of soil that held moisture once again. Yet perhaps the deepest shift was psychological. For decades, the people of Burkina Faso had been told they were poor. Too poor to build, too poor to imagine, too poor to act without waiting for others. But the bottle houses shattered that narrative. Suddenly, poverty was not only an obstacle, but also a resource. What the world despised, Burkinabe hands transformed into value. Each wall was a mirror reflecting back not weakness, but strength. Politically, the initiative became a symbol. In a country often portrayed as dependent on foreign aid, the sight of villagers constructing their own homes from their own waste was sovereignty in action. Leaders in Ouagadougou began to frame the movement not just as environmental policy, but as a national rebirth, a declaration that Burkina Faso could write its own solutions without waiting for donors to dictate terms. This symbolism echoed against another chapter of the nation's story, the Ibrahim Traoré coup. Just as the political upheaval had been born from frustration with dependency and the hunger for dignity, the environmental revolution mirrored the same desire. Both were statements of self-rule, both rejections of weakness, both declarations that the future would no longer be imported, but built from within. For some, the bottle houses were not merely walls of plastic. They were walls of defiance, standing as firmly against despair as against storms. But the transformation also unsettled old powers. Traditional construction companies reliant on cement imports saw their markets threatened. Bureaucrats demanded regulations and safety tests before recognizing bottle houses as official. Some elites feared losing influence if communities became too self-sufficient. The initiative, though environmental in appearance, was deeply political, redistributing dignity from boardrooms to villages, from speeches to calloused hands. Still, the people carried it forward. Farmers who once walked miles to cut wood now helped their children study under electric lights powered by recycled fuel. Teachers welcomed pupils into classrooms that stood firm against storms. Villagers who had lived with silence at night now heard the hum of small generators and the laughter of children playing under lamps. A quiet revolution had taken root. It was no longer about bottles. It was about sovereignty, pride, and the conviction that even the smallest landlocked nation could carve its own future from waste. But sovereignty never exists in isolation, and soon the gaze of the international community would fall upon Burkina Faso's bottle-built revolution. The experiment in Burkina Faso did not remain hidden for long. What began as a village initiative soon drew the attention of international observers, forcing the world to decide whether to dismiss it as a curiosity or embrace it as a model for the future. The first to acknowledge it was the United Nations Environment Program. Delegates traveled to Ouagadougou and described the bottle houses as a unique pilot of circular economy in West Africa. Their report highlighted how local communities turned waste into both construction material and energy, recommending that neighboring states take note. For the first time, a village initiative had been elevated to the stage of global policy. The African Union quickly followed. Officials celebrated the project as a made-in-Africa solution, proof that innovation could emerge from within the continent without waiting for outside expertise. They framed it as sovereignty expressed not only in speeches or parliaments, but in the daily labor of villagers reclaiming their resources. Europe's response was pragmatic but intrigued. The European Union explored ways to link the initiative with its Green Climate Fund. Engineers from Germany and the Netherlands tested the durability of bottle bricks, assessing whether the method could be scaled. European diplomats promoted the story as grassroots climate action, precisely the kind of narrative they sought to showcase in international forums. The United States, however, sent mixed signals. Through its Young African Leaders Initiative, Washington praised Ibrahim Traoré as a symbol of resilience and innovation. Universities like MIT and Stanford expressed interest in research partnerships. Yet in the shadows, oil companies in Houston and New York grew uneasy. If poor nations could transform plastic waste into fuel, would they still depend on imported fossil energy? The promise of independence unsettled the architecture of dependency. Meanwhile, global media amplified the story. BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24 aired documentaries dubbing Ibrahim the plastic revolutionary. National Geographic featured the bottle houses as icons of hope in the heart of the Sahel. Overnight, a country once invisible on the world stage became a laboratory of possibility. Some even called it the dawn of a Burkina Faso revolution in environmental thinking, a reminder that Africa need not wait for aid, but could script its own destiny. But visibility brought politics. Supporters framed it as innovation, critics as defiance. Donors questioned whether grassroots independence would disrupt traditional aid flows. The applause in classrooms echoed in diplomatic halls, and the world's gaze grew heavier by the day. The world was watching, but would the future of Burkina Faso be carried by applause or tested by the weight of expectation? Every revolution carries both promise and peril, And the plastic revolution of Burkina Faso is no exception. The vision that began with bottles on riverbanks has grown into classrooms, homes, and clinics. Yet scaling it further demands more than dreams. The first obstacle is infrastructure. Collecting millions of bottles from scattered villages is no simple task. Roads remain poor, transport is slow, and without centralized hubs, the recycling chain relies heavily on community volunteers. To expand, the initiative will require trucks, storage centers, and organized networks stretching across the nation. Quality and safety also stand as questions yet to be fully answered. While eco-bricks have proven strong, critics insist that widespread adoption demands building codes, certifications, and rigorous testing. Are the walls fire-resistant? How do they age over decades? To silence skeptics and secure official recognition, the bottle houses must pass the standards that govern traditional construction. Financing presents another challenge. The small recycling plants that turn plastic into biofuel need significant investment to scale up. So far, the initiative has survived on donations, local labor, and modest grants. But to power entire districts, Ibrahim's team will need partnerships with banks, climate funds, or private investors. Each brings the risk of diluting the independence that makes the project so inspiring. Yet the opportunities shine just as brightly. Neighboring Sahel nations, from Mali to Niger, have expressed interest in learning from Burkina Faso's model. Could the country become a regional hub for waste-to-energy solutions, exporting not just methods but expertise? Already visitors arrive to see eco-villages where streets are lined with colorful bottle walls. Researchers, journalists, and NGOs call them living laboratories. If expanded, they could attract tourism and academic exchange, turning waste into foreign revenue. Perhaps the greatest achievement, however, lies in the psychology of the nation. A generation of Burkinabe youth now look at rubbish not as decay, but as potential. They identify themselves as creators and protectors of their land. That mental shift from dependency to agency is the foundation of long-term resilience. The road ahead will require courage, policy reform, investment, and international cooperation. But the direction is clear: a Burkina Faso that no longer begs for solutions, but builds them with its own hands. And as Ibrahim often reminds his people, if one small, landlocked country can transform garbage into light, what stops the rest of the world? The story of Ibrahim Traoré is not about bottles. It is about rewriting the fate of a nation once dismissed as powerless. What the world saw as waste, he saw as foundation stones. What others treated as poison, he transformed into light, shelter, and education. In Burkina Faso today, a bottle is no longer a curse. It is a symbol of sovereignty. Walk through a village and you will see children stepping into classrooms where walls once grew from rubbish. Mothers sit in homes that stand firm against the rains. Clinics run under clean electric light powered by fuel that was once trash. Forests breathe again as fewer trees are cut, and young men find work not in war, but in creation. Every wall, every lamp, every eco-brick carries the same message. Dignity can be built with bare hands. The world has begun to notice. Journalists call it a revolution. International bodies debate its implications. Some compare it directly with the Ibrahim Traoré coup, both born of frustration with dependency and both declaring that sovereignty must be claimed, not granted. Just as the coup shook the corridors of political power, the bottle houses now challenge assumptions about development itself. This movement is more than environmental. It is cultural, political, spiritual. It has been described as a Burkina Faso revolution in thinking, a turning point where Africa ceases to wait for aid and instead writes its own future. And at its center stands a man who turned rivers of plastic into rivers of hope. The parallels are striking. The Ibrahim Traoré coup reminded the world that political independence is not enough without dignity. The bottle revolution now proves that even waste can become the architecture of sovereignty. Together, they form a single message. The power to transform lies not in outside hands, but in the calloused hands of Burkinabe themselves. The question that remains is no longer whether this works. It does. The question is whether the rest of the world will have the courage to follow. If bottles can become schools, if trash can power hospitals, then perhaps no community is too poor to create. Stay with us. Share this story. Subscribe, because the revolution of dignity has only just begun, and the next chapter may be written in your own hands.